Hi, welcome to class. My name is Patricia. Today we will be talking about movement and range of motion. So before we begin on talking about range of movement, let's start with just a question. So how is this course going to make me a better yoga teacher? Anatomy is the study of the body, and the body is made up of a huge, vast amount of different systems that come together to work together. And so when we are being a yoga teacher, we're guiding people and moving their bodies. So the more that we can understand how the body works and everything that needs to take place to give our students the best chance of being able to experience the pose or experience yoga in the best possible way. So in this class in particular, we're going to be focusing on a couple of items in general and trying to apply it towards being a yoga teacher. So the first thing is understanding movement and understanding range of motion. Range of motion is usually associated with flexibility. So learning what that is and then how do we increase it. And the next thing is to understand the possible causes of the restriction in the body. So when we experience a pose, some of us will experience it in very different places. So for folding, you might experience it in the back, maybe in the hamstrings. It depends on the person. And so understanding everything that is involved in the body when we're in a pose, then we can slowly begin to find where that restriction is. Because sometimes when we're forward folding, we might think that maybe it's the hamstrings but it could actually be coming from other parts of the body. And next thing is understanding the variations in the body and just understanding that everybody is different, all different shapes, forms, age, all these different things have to come into mind when people are coming into a class, that some poses will be more accessible than others. And learning how to safely guide people into poses. So in this course or this lecture in particular, we're going to talk about how some simple principles on to begin to help integrate muscles and also to protect joints, create stability so that we can safely guide people into poses. Last thing I'd like to mention before I move on is that remember that as yoga teachers, we are not doctors, physiotherapists, chiropractors, or therapists. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know. As you become a teacher, you're going to see a lot of different people with all sorts of different conditions or going through all sorts of different things in their life. And for a yoga teacher, we're there to create a safe space for them to just be able to move, relax, and let go of things that don't serve them and just kind of step away from all those conditions that they normally perhaps have to experience through their daily life. So in no way are we really equipped to cure or treat and to really fix a lot of the things that a lot of people that come into the studio are going through. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know, and referring them to someone who you think would be able to help them. So let's go into the material. First thing is range of motion. The range of motion is the extent of movement of a joint. It's measured in the degrees of a circle. So looking on your right, you can see a very general evaluation chart. And that's a very typical way for us to be able to track and calculate and assess the range of motion. So the things to remember is that not all joints have the same available movements. And you probably notice in the body, some things move a little bit more freely than others. And there's a lot of variations in individuals. So some of the factors that may affect the range of motion in an individual is age. As we get older, unfortunately, our joints do get more fibrous and they get a little bit, as they say, tighter, and we lose range of motion. Psychology, so mental health is actually a really big part in range of motion, the suppleness of the body. And lifestyle, work, temperature, so the warmer it is, then the more easily it is for our muscles to lengthen, so the range of motion generally increases usually as the temperature rises. But of course, too high, then it becomes more of a negative effect than positive. And the time of day, a lot of the yoga books or yoga practices suggest that we should be practicing yoga between around 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. That's usually when the body is the most receptive to asana practice or physical practice. And of course, injury and many other factors could affect range of motion in the body. Now let's talk about the types of range of motions. So there are two types. There's an active and there is a passive. So you can probably guess that active means engagement. There is muscle engagement that has to happen for the movement to occur. And the next one is passive, where the person is relaxed and movement, or this range of movement that is created, is either done naturally by the gravity or by manual assistance. So physiotherapists, or maybe when you go into a massage and they're moving your limbs for you, that would be more of a passive way of moving into range of motion. So now let's try going through some of the range of the motions of your hip. So coming on to perhaps your mat or just standing up and just moving the hip. We're not going to worry too much about the anatomical terms. We'll worry about that later on as we keep moving on. But active range of motion, so using your muscles to actually be able to move this hip joint. So we can pull it up in front. We can take it out to the side. We can bring it back in. We can take it across the body. We can take it forward. We can take it back. And then also we can circumduct, so we can kind of draw circles. So you can kind of see right away what that range of motion is. And let's reverse that just to even out our joint. So this is using our active muscles engagement to be able to move the joint. Now, what if we're talking about passive? A lot of the passive stretches, you can imagine when you're sitting down, Baddha Konasana, soles of the feet together. And naturally, the gravity is going to be giving you the stretch and moving you into that range of motion. So that place of kind of the edge. But let's turn this into an active stretch. If we're turning into the active stretch, then we can actively use our muscles to engage. And we'll talk more about this as we learn the muscle groups specifically. But if we gauge the outer side to actually press the feet in and pull the knees towards the floor by contracting kind of where your hip, your outer hip muscles are, then you'll be able to actively find maybe perhaps a little bit more. But we can use these methods together. So let's talk about the planes of the body. So the planes of the body is really there to help us begin to describe the body in anatomical terms. And when we start to go deeper into anatomy, we'll be using anatomical terms to describe a lot of the things. So this is a great way to just start to get comfortable with some of these terminologies. And once you do get comfortable, you'll get familiar with them. They get repeated a lot, and it becomes easier to remember. So the body can be divided or sectioned into many different ways. So we're going to talk about the three ways that the body can be sectioned off. The first way is the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane goes right down towards the center of your body, right down the midline, and it divides the body from the left side to the right side. Anything close to the center, we say it's medial. Anything away from the center line, we say lateral. So medial, lateral. And these are important because they help describe the body. So sometimes maybe it's a landmark or maybe a way the body moves. We will be using these terms medial and lateral. So one of the things when we start talking about movement, we talk about rotation. So medial rotation would be internal rotation. Lateral rotation would be external rotation. So rotating outwards, rotating inwards. But you'll get familiar with those as we move into the anatomy portion a bit more. The second way that we can divide the body is transverse. And transverse is also called the horizontal plane. So we can cut the body many ways. But in this particular way, we're going to say right down in the center of the body, separating the body into two halves, the upper half and the lower section. Anything, so where we cut, anything above that line, we will say it's superior, so higher, the upper part. Anything below that section or below that line, we will refer to as inferior. And a lot of times we use these terminologies when we're talking about certain landmarks and we're talking whether it's superior, inferior. For example, your hip, where you can feel that bone. In that knob, you have the crest, and below that, you have the ASIS, the anterior superior iliac spine. So right there, superior, saying that it is the higher one because there is a lower one, AIIS, anterior inferior iliac spine. And this leads us to our last way of dividing the body, which is the frontal and coronal plane. This one is from ear to ear, and it cuts the body from the front to and the back. So it separates the front part of the body to the back part of the body. And the front part we refer to as anterior. The back part is referred to as posterior. And so we've already heard this landmark here, the ASIS, anterior superior iliac spine, meaning that it's anterior, the front of the body, superior, so above the other landmark that we will talk about later, which is the inferior one, and then iliac spine because it's located on the ilium at the spine of the ilium. So you can see that all the words kind of start to make sense when we start to apply them. And some other terms that you might hear and use to describe something in anatomic position is dorsal and ventral. Dorsal you probably hear more towards when we're talking about the feet, the dorsiflexion. So dorsal is the top, and then ventral would be the belly side, the underside of that. And another one is central and peripheral, and you can probably guess central is more towards the middle, peripheral is more towards the outer edges or the extremities. And proximal distal, this is also depending on your reference point. Let's say my reference point is my torso, my body. My elbow is proximal to my torso compared to my hand is more distal to my chest or my body. So those can be used to describe as well. And the last one, superficial and deep. And it's exactly as it means. Superficial meaning more on the surface, deep meaning deeper under the surface. And for example, your rectus abdominis, so your six-pack muscle, is going to be the most superficial abdominal muscles. And your deepest is going to be the TVA, the transverse abdominis, which is under like a corset. Again, don't worry about these things that we will talk about and you'll be able to see and also experience a little bit more. But those are the general ways that we can divide the body and we can use to describe position or describe the body. So now we're going to add the element of movement into these planes. So starting with coronal frontal plane again. So remember, coronal frontal plane is when we divide ear to ear and we section the body from the front and then the back half. So different in the way that we're not talking about anterior, posterior, but we're talking about the movement in this plane. So the type of movement that can happen in this plane is lateral flexion, which is side bending. So we can side bend through our torso as well as our neck. So lateral flexion, so flexion sideways. And we can do abduction, which is taking the arms or taking the legs out away from the midline, abducting. Adduction is drawing it in. And then we have inversion and eversion. That refers to the movement of the ankle. So these are my feet. Inversion, soles of feet roll in. Eversion, roll out. Or the ankle rolls in, the soles of foot roll out. So inversion, eversion. And then there's ulnar and radial deviation. That refers to the forearm bones. And that's just this side to side movement. And don't worry, again, all this stuff will make sense as we go along. But those are the movements that can happen in this plane. So anything that moves and in that plane of the body, that's a type of movement. Second one we'll talk about is sagittal. So sagittal, remembering we were cutting the body from the left and the right side, so right down the center. So the type of movement that happens in this plane, so remember the other plane was out to the sides, this one's front to back plane. And you're probably more familiar with the motions. We can do flexion, taking in front of us, extension, taking the arm back. Dorsiflexion refers to the foot, which is flexing the toes towards your shin, and then plantar flexion, pointing the toes, planting the toes down. So those are the movements in the sagittal plane. And lastly, transverse plane, that was the horizontal plane. So anything that moves kind of in this plane. So the type of things that can move in is more the rotation. So we have the internal rotation or medial rotation, external or lateral rotation, right? So we can rotate the arm, the leg, the hand, the head, and then horizontal abduction. So abduction, remember, was taking the arms away, and adduction was bringing it in. But horizontal is moving in this direction. So from here, adduction, abduction. And we talked about some of the rotation already. It can rotate through the joints or through even the torso. And the last one, supination and pronation. Supination, pronation refers to the forearms and the wrist. Supination, turning the palms up like holding soup. Pronation, turning the palms down. So this is probably all review from the previous section, but it's good to practice. So now let's try to apply it. So looking at this, this is a variation of a camel pose, Ustrasana. Now let's start to look at some of the joints and identify what is going on. So let's first look at the left shoulder joint. The left shoulder joint, you can think about, I'll give you a couple seconds, what kind of movement is happening in that left shoulder joint? It is extension in the left shoulder joint. And how about the right shoulder? The right shoulder, just if you get stuck, you can do it in a normal position rather than doing the actual pose. And just think of one arm is back, the other arm is by the ear. So the right arm is in flexion. If we look at the hips, what kind of movement is going on in the hips? The hips are going through extension. And how about the spine? Spine is also going through extension, moving in that plane, the same plane. And how about the knees? The knees are in flexion. And the last thing, let's look at the ankles. The ankles, remembering it's either dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. And if you look closely, you can see that the feet are flexed, so they're more in a dorsiflexion. So that's just starting to become even more familiar with these movements and starting to put them into our practice of yoga. So let's try another one. I'm going to give you some instructions and let's see if I successfully get you in the pose I want to, but using only anatomical terms. So try with me if you can, standing up. Standing in anatomical position, abduct your left leg. Abduct, remember, meaning away from the body. Now abduct your right leg. Again, away from the body. Now turn your right toes laterally. And then flex your right knee joint. Abduct the arms the height of your shoulders. And pronate the arms. So let's see. How did you do? Did you get something like this? Hopefully you did. If you didn't, it might have been my mistake as I was cueing, but it's really difficult to cue in anatomical terms. So thankfully you don't have to do that when you teach yoga. But these do help us because as we start to learn the muscles, we'll be learning them in anatomical terms. So knowing what the body is doing anatomically can help you be able to start to bridge that gap between anatomy terminology and the practice of yoga.